In the aftermath of the Great War, the German Navy, the Kaiserlich Marine, was a ghost, scuttled by its own crews at Scapa Flow and shackled by the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forbidden from possessing a fleet that could challenge the masters of the sea, Britain's Royal Navy. The treaty limited them to a handful of outdated coastal defense ships, with strict tonnage limits designed to ensure the Kriegsmarine, the new German Navy, would never again threaten British dominance. For Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander of this phantom fleet, the situation was untenable. He was a naval traditionalist, a man who believed that Germany's destiny was tied to its power at sea. But he could not win a numbers game against the Royal Navy. The British could build 3 battleships for everyone he was allowed. Raeder understood that if Germany were to ever challenge Britain, it would have to be through quality, not quantity. He needed a new kind of warship, a predator designed not for fleet-on-fleet battles, but for the economic jugular of the British Empire, its merchant convoys. The first answer to Raeder's problem was the Deutschland-class cruiser, better known to the world as the pocket battleship. Ships like the Admiral Graf Spee were masterpieces of engineering compromise, heavily armed for their size and powered by innovative diesel engines that gave them immense range. They were designed to a specific doctrine, to be faster than anything stronger, and stronger than anything faster. They were perfect commerce raiders, built to appear anywhere in the vastness of the Atlantic, sink merchant ships, and vanish before the Royal Navy could corner them. They were a brilliant solution to a strategic problem, but Raeder knew they were a stopgap. To truly cripple Britain, he needed something far more powerful. He needed a true battleship, one so advanced and so formidable that it could hunt down and destroy the very British warships assigned to protect the convoys. The result of this ambition was the Bismarck-class battleship. Working in secret, German naval architects systematically ignored the treaty limitations they had publicly agreed to. They poured every resource and every mark of German engineering prowess into creating a vessel that was, on paper, the most powerful warship in the world. The design was a testament to the quality over quantity philosophy. Her 8 15-inch guns were housed in state-of-the-art turrets and paired with some of the most advanced optical rangefinders ever created, giving Bismarck unparalleled accuracy. Her armor scheme was a marvel of protection, a thick citadel of cemented steel designed to defeat any shell the Royal Navy could fire at her. And her powerful steam turbines could propel the 50,000-ton Leviathan at speeds exceeding 30 knots, allowing her to choose her engagements. The ship was a synthesis of German naval theory, a heavily armored, fast, and precise killing machine designed specifically to dominate the North Atlantic. In the minds of Raeder and the German High Command, Bismarck and her sister ship Tirpitz were the ultimate problem solvers. They were the key to starving Britain into submission. But like so many perfect solutions conceived in the abstract, the Bismarck carried within its design the seeds of its own destruction. The very design philosophy that prioritized survivability through heavy armor and speed forced compromises in other areas. In their obsession to build an unsinkable ship, the architects had overlooked a critical vulnerability. It was not a flaw born of incompetence, but of doctrine. A single accepted trade-off in the ship's design that, under a unique and unforeseen set of circumstances, would prove to be a fatal one. The design philosophy behind the Bismarck was forged in the fire and steel of the Battle of Jutland in 1916. German naval observers had watched in shock as several British battlecruisers, lauded for their speed and massive guns, vaporized in catastrophic explosions after taking direct hits. Their lightly protected ammunition magazines had been their fatal flaw. Grand Admiral Raeder's engineers were determined not to repeat this mistake. Their solution was a brutalist concept of protection known as the armored citadel. The principle was to concentrate the vast majority of the ship's armor around its vital core, creating an internal fortress that would shield the engines, boilers, and ammunition stores from harm. This citadel was engineered to be virtually impenetrable, a vault of high-grade Watton steel capable of defeating the largest shells in the Royal Navy's arsenal. To supplement this, the designers incorporated a sophisticated torpedo defense system, a layered void and bulkhead arrangement designed to absorb and dissipate the explosive force of an underwater detonation before it could reach the ship as heart. This concentration of armor, however, came at a cost in weight. To keep the Bismarck within a manageable displacement and maintain its high speed, a difficult compromise had to be made. The sections of the ship outside the main citadel, the long, Elegant bow and the equally crucial stern were afforded significantly less protection. This was a standard accepted practice in naval design, a calculated risk based on the assumption that damage to these expendable areas, while problematic, would not result in the immediate loss of the ship. Flooding in the bow or stern could be contained and managed by the ship's powerful pumping systems. In theory, the Bismarck could absorb numerous hits to its extremities and still steam onward, its main guns still firing, its engines still turning. The fortress at its core would remain inviolate. The ship steering was controlled by a twin rudder system located at the very end of the stern section. This was a conventional and well-tested design, providing excellent maneuverability. The rudders themselves and the intricate machinery that turned them, the steering engines, control linkages, and hydraulic presses were housed in this lightly protected aft compartment. The designers had shielded these components from direct shell fire from above with an armored deck, but they were critically vulnerable to any underwater damage from the sides or below. The torpedo defense system that was so robust amidships was significantly tapered and less comprehensive at the extreme ends of the vessel. The logic was clear. A torpedo hit to the stern was a flooding problem, not a survivability problem. Here, in this seemingly logical trade-off, lay the hidden flaw. The German engineers had brilliantly protected the Bismarck's ability to float and its ability to fight. They had failed, however, to adequately protect its ability to navigate. They had obsessed over shielding the ship's heart and lungs, but had left its nervous system exposed. For a battleship operating within a fleet, a loss of steering could be a temporary inconvenience until a tow could be arranged. But for a lone commerce raider like the Bismarck, designed to operate independently for weeks in the hostile expanse of the Atlantic, the ability to steer was as vital as its engines. A ship that cannot control its direction cannot run, it cannot hide, and it cannot effectively aim its weapons. It becomes a sitting duck. This single critical oversight, born from a doctrine that prized survivability above all else, had created a specific and catastrophic point of failure. The order to unleash Germany's new weapon came in the spring of 1941. Codenamed Operation Rheinübung, or Rhine Exercise, the mission was audacious in its scope. The Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, was to break out from the Baltic Sea into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. Their objective was not to seek battle with the Royal Navy, but to avoid it. They were to become ghosts, preying on the vital Allied convoys that carried supplies, munitions, and food from North America to Great Britain. German intelligence estimated that if the two ships could operate unmolested for even a few months, the cumulative damage to British shipping would be catastrophic, potentially starving the island nation into submission. The entire operation hinged on the element of surprise and the Bismarck's ability to outrun or outfight any Guardian warships it encountered. Command of the task force was given to Admiral Gunther Lütjens, a veteran naval officer known for his cautious, methodical nature. Lütjens was not a swashbuckling raider. He was a meticulous planner who understood the immense risks involved. He was keenly aware that he was sailing into a sea controlled by a numerically superior enemy, and that the survival of his ships depended on stealth and discretion. His orders from Grand Admiral Raeder were explicit. The primary target was merchant shipping, and engagements with enemy warships were to be avoided, unless they directly threatened his mission. The Bismarck was a capital asset, a queen on the naval chessboard, and she was not to be risked frivolously. This cautious doctrine would directly clash with the aggressive confidence of the ship's own captain, Ernst Lindemann, who believed his vessel was more than a match for anything the Royal Navy could field. The breakout began on May 18, 1941. Slipping out of their port in occupied Poland under the cover of darkness, the two German warships began their perilous journey north, navigating the narrow straits between Denmark and Sweden. But in an age of aerial reconnaissance, keeping such a massive operation secret was nearly impossible. The ships were spotted by the Swedish cruiser Gotland and later by Norwegian resistance fighters, who relayed the information to British intelligence. The British Admiralty, now alerted to the breakout, began to move its own chess pieces. From their naval base at Scapa Flow, the pride of the British home fleet, the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the new battleship, Prince of Wales, were dispatched to guard the Iceland-Greenland Gap, the most likely route into the Atlantic. The first confrontation occurred in the frigid waters of the Denmark Strait on the morning of May 24th. The British ships made visual contact and closed for battle. The Hood, a symbol of British sea power for over 2 decades, was a magnificent, but aging warship with a critical flaw of its own. thin deck armor that made it vulnerable to plunging shells. Lutyens, adhering to his orders, was hesitant to engage, but the British forced his hand. As the giants traded salvos at a range of over 10 miles, the Bismarck's superior gunnery and range-finding technology proved decisive. A shell from one of its main turrets plunged into the Hood, penetrating to an aft magazine. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic, tearing the massive battlecruiser in half and sending it to the bottom in less than 3 minutes. The sinking of the Hood was a stunning victory, a vindication of German naval engineering, but it came at a price. In the brief exchange, the Bismarck had been hit by a shell from the Prince of Wales, causing minor but significant damage. One of the hits had ruptured a forward fuel tank, causing the ship to leak a trail of precious oil into the sea. The damage was not critical, but the oil slick was a breadcrumb trail that the hunters could follow. More importantly, the invincible Predator had been wounded, and in doing so, it had revealed its position to the entire Royal Navy. The time for stealth was over. The victory over the Hood was glorious, but its cost was now becoming dangerously apparent on the bridge of the Bismarck. While the damage from the Prince of Wales shell had not compromised the ship's structural integrity, it had inflicted a wound that was arguably more severe. The forward fuel tank was leaking a steady, iridescent stream of oil into the Atlantic, a telltale trail for the enemy to follow. More critically, the hit had contaminated a significant portion of the ship's remaining fuel reserves with seawater, drastically reducing its operational range. The original mission of a long, leisurely commerce raid was now a logistical impossibility. Admiral Lutyens was faced with the first critical decision of the operation, a choice that would determine the fate of his command. The element of surprise was gone, the ship was bleeding fuel, and the full might of the Royal Navy was mobilizing against him. Lutyens, a man defined by caution, weighed his grim options. He could attempt to turn back to Germany the way he came, but he knew the British would have every channel heavily guarded. He could try to push forward into the vastness of the Atlantic, but with his reduced fuel, he would be a lame duck, unable to conduct his mission or outrun his pursuers. A third option remained, a desperate dash for the coast of occupied France. The massive dry docks at Saint-Nazaire were the only facilities outside of Germany capable of repairing a ship of Bismarck's size. It was the most logical choice for survival, but it required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean, an area the British considered their own backyard. After a tense conference with his staff, the decision was made. The Bismarck would make for France. To increase the odds of at least part of his force succeeding, Lutyens ordered the undamaged Prinz Eugen to detach and slip away to begin its own lonely hunt, leaving the Bismarck to draw the full undivided attention of the Royal Navy. In London, the news of the Hood's sinking had transformed the naval operation from a strategic interception into a vengeful pursuit. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a simple, chilling order to the fleet: sink the Bismarck. The signal went out to every British warship in the North Atlantic. From Scapa Flow, Admiral Sir John Tovey, aboard his flagship HMS King George V, led the main body of the home fleet in a relentless chase. Cruisers that had been shadowing the German ships, like the HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk, clung to the edges of radar range, acting as the eyes of the fleet, continuously reporting Bismarck's position. The hunt was no longer just a matter of naval strategy. It was a matter of national honor. The Royal Navy, stung by the loss of its most famous ship, was now a wounded animal, and it would not rest until its target was destroyed. But the most dangerous threat to the Bismarck was not coming from the north. From the British naval base at Gibraltar, a powerful squadron known as Force H was ordered to sail at maximum speed to intercept. Commanded by Admiral James Somerville, this force included the battlecruiser HMS Renown, the cruiser HMS Sheffield, and the vessel that would ultimately seal Bismarck's fate, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. For now, the chase was a two-dimensional game of speed and endurance across the surface of the ocean. But the entry of the Ark Royal into the theater was about to change the very nature of the battle. The era of the battleship as the undisputed queen of the seas was drawing to a close, and the age of naval air power was about to deliver a fatal lesson to the pride of the German Navy. The chase across the North Atlantic settled into a brutal test of endurance. For 2 days, the British cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk clung to the Bismarck like shadows, battling mountainous seas and poor visibility. Their early radar sets, while revolutionary, were primitive by modern standards, and maintaining contact with a fast-moving target in the squalls and storms of the Atlantic was a monumental challenge. Aboard the Bismarck, Admiral Lutyens was acutely aware of these shadowing ships. They were the hounds on his trail, constantly reporting his position to the main British fleet that was closing in from behind. His only hope of reaching the safety of the French coast was to shake them, to perform a vanishing act in the vast gray wilderness of the ocean. On the evening of May 25th, Lutyens saw his opportunity. As darkness fell and another storm front moved in, he ordered a daring and brilliantly executed maneuver. The Bismarck, at near top speed, made a sudden wide 270-degree turn, first swinging south and then east, effectively looping behind its pursuers. The British cruisers, struggling to maintain contact in the worsening weather, sailed onward, completely unaware that their quarry was now steaming away in the opposite direction. For several tense minutes, the radar screens on the British ships showed nothing but the chaotic returns of the churning sea. Then, the horrifying realization dawned. Contact was lost. The Bismarck was gone. A wave of desperation swept through the British Admiralty and the flag bridge of Admiral Tovey's flagship. The most powerful battleship in the world was loose in the Atlantic, its location unknown. It was a catastrophic failure. Tovey, working with the limited information he had, made a calculated assumption. He believed Lutyens would use this opportunity to double back towards the safer, more familiar route to Germany between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Acting on this assumption, he ordered the bulk of his fleet to alter course northward to intercept this presumed escape route. For a few critical hours, the entire British hunting party was heading in the wrong direction. It was at this moment of tactical brilliance that Admiral Lutyens made a simple, human error, a fatal flaw not of engineering but of judgment. Believing that the British cruiser's powerful radar was still tracking him despite his maneuver, he concluded that maintaining radio silence was pointless. Confident in his escape, he authorized a lengthy, 30-minute radio transmission to Naval Group Command West in Paris. The message was a detailed report on the sinking of the Hood, his own ship's damage, and his intention to make for St. Nazaire. Lutyens believed he was simply updating his superiors. In reality, he was providing his hunters with an invisible beacon. British high-frequency direction-finding stations, from Iceland to the coast of England, immediately intercepted the transmission. While the initial plots were imprecise, they provided one piece of irrefutable, game-changing intelligence. The signals were coming from a position far to the south of where Tovey was searching. The Bismarck was not heading back to Germany. It was still making a run for France. Lutyens' brilliant maneuver had been completely undone by his own voice. The alarm was sounded across the fleet. Tovey, realizing his mistake, reversed course, ordering his ships to steam south at flank speed. The hunt, which had seemed all but lost, was now back on with a vengeance. Est one crucial attribute: they could carry a single 18-inch torpedo, and they could deliver it with surprising accuracy in the hands of a skilled crew. The first strike launched from the Ark Royal was a near disaster, a case of mistaken identity that almost ended the hunt in ignominy. The pilots, flying in atrocious weather with poor visibility, mistakenly targeted the British cruiser HMS Sheffield, which had been sent ahead to shadow the Bismarck. They launched their torpedoes, but fortunately, a combination of skillful maneuvering by the Sheffield's captain and faulty magnetic detonators on the torpedoes meant no hits were scored. The embarrassed pilots returned to the carrier where the ground crews, now aware of the detonator problem, worked frantically to rearm the planes with older but more reliable contact-fused torpedoes. There would only be enough time in daylight for one more attack. This was the last chance. As dusk began to settle over the storm-ravaged Atlantic, a second strike of 15 swordfish took off from the pitching flight deck of the Ark Royal. They were flying into the teeth of a gale, with waves reaching over 50 feet and winds that threatened to tear the fragile biplanes apart. This time they found their true target. The Bismarck's lookout spotted the slow-moving aircraft approaching, and the ship erupted in a volcano of fire. Every anti-aircraft gun, from the heavy 10.5 cm cannons to the smaller 2 cm automatic weapons, threw a wall of flak and tracers into the sky. For the swordfish pilots, flying at just a few hundred feet above the waves, it was a suicidal run into the heart of the storm. The German gunners threw up a nearly impenetrable wall of fire, but the storm was an unwitting ally to the attacking swordfish. The gale-force winds and violent seas made the Bismarck a wildly unstable gun platform. As the ship heaved and rolled, its gunners struggled to track the small, slow-moving biplanes that skimmed just above the crests of the waves, disappearing into the troughs. For the British pilots, the approach was a disorienting nightmare of sea spray, smoke, and the orange blossoms of exploding flak shells. They pressed their attacks with a cold, calculated bravery, dropping their torpedoes into the churning water as they veered away at the last possible second. One by one, the torpedoes streaked towards the target. Most missed, their tracks thrown off by the violent seas or by the skillful maneuvering of Captain Lindemann. One torpedo struck the Bismarck amidships, right on its main armor belt. The crew felt a heavy shudder, but the thick Krupp steel absorbed the blast with contemptuous ease, causing only minor damage and some flooding. The citadel, the ship's armored heart, had held. It seemed the Bismarck was indeed invulnerable. But as the last wave of attackers made their runs, a single torpedo, dropped from a swordfish flown by Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, found its mark in the one place the ship could not defend. It struck the Bismarck's unarmored stern. The explosion was not catastrophic in terms of structural damage. It did not rip a gaping hole in the hull or threaten to sink the ship directly. Instead, the blast wave acted like a giant hydraulic hammer, warping the massive steel rudder stalks and forcing the port rudder into a hard 12-degree turn. On the bridge, the helmsman desperately spun the wheel, but there was no response. The telemotors that controlled the starboard rudder were also knocked out. The Bismarck's nervous system had been severed. The ship was locked into a slow, inexorable turn to port, unable to straighten its course. Aboard the Bismarck, a controlled and professional response quickly gave way to desperation. Damage control teams reported that the rudder rooms were flooded and inaccessible. Engineers proposed a daring plan to use explosive charges to sever the jammed rudder entirely, hoping they could then steer the ship using only its powerful propellers. Divers were sent over the side into the raging, freezing sea in a futile attempt to assess the damage. But the storm that had aided the Swordfish now worked against the German crew. The relentless waves made any external repair work impossible. The explosive charges failed to cut through the thick steel of the rudder post. Nothing worked. The pride of the German Navy, the most powerful battleship in the world, was now steaming in a wide, uncontrollable circle. On the bridge, the mood shifted from grim determination to a quiet, horrifying realization of their fate. Admiral Lutjens, who had gambled everything on reaching France, now saw his destination slipping away with every degree of the ship's relentless turn. Every attempt to correct the course only tightened the circle. The storm, which had been their cover, was now their prison, and the wind that they had hoped would carry them to safety was now pushing them northwest, back into the waiting arms of Admiral Tovey's fleet. The fatal flaw, the single point of failure that had been a theoretical footnote on a blueprint in Hamburg, had been found and exploited by a relic of a bygone era. The Swordfish attack was over. The British pilots, low on fuel and battered by the storm, turned for the distant beacon of the Ark Royal, their mission complete. They had not sunk the Bismarck, but they had done something far more decisive. They had passed a death sentence. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. Throughout the long, dark night of May 26th, the Bismarck was a wounded giant, tormented by a pack of wolves. The first British ships to arrive on the scene were not the heavy battleships, but a flotilla of 5 destroyers led by the aggressive Captain Philip Vian. Vian's ships, including the HMS Cossack and HM Zulu, were hopelessly outgunned by their target, and in the raging seas, their chances of scoring a decisive torpedo hit were slim to none. But their mission was not to sink the Bismarck. It was to ensure that it did not escape, and to deny its crew a single moment of rest or respite. For 8 agonizing hours they circled the crippled battleship, a relentless ring of steel in the darkness. The destroyers darted in and out of the storm, launching torpedoes that were mostly lost to the violent waves. They fired star shells that burst high above the Bismarck, bathing the German ship in an eerie, ghostly light and confirming its position for the approaching fleet. The attacks were more psychological than physical. For the German crew, already exhausted and demoralized by the knowledge of their ship's paralysis, it was a night of hell. Every few minutes, alarms would blare as another destroyer lunged out of the darkness. The ship's secondary guns would reply with thunderous, but largely ineffective, salvos into the night. Sleep was impossible. The constant tension, the explosions of the star shells, and the shudder of near misses wore down their resolve. They were trapped, blinded, and being harassed from all sides, all while fighting a losing battle against the storm and their own crippled vessel. Aboard the bridge, a sense of grim resignation had set in. Admiral Lutyens, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, sent a final message to German Naval Command. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." Throughout the ship, sailors who were not on duty were encouraged to write final letters to their families, small scraps of paper that would go down with them to the bottom of the sea. They had done everything humanly possible. They had fought with skill and bravery, and their ship had withstood incredible punishment. But they had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a single, catastrophic stroke of bad luck that had exploited the one flaw in their magnificent machine. Now there was nothing left to do but face the dawn. As the first gray light of morning broke on May 27th, the storm finally began to subside. The seas, while still heavy, were no longer the chaotic mountains of the previous night. The visibility improved. And then, on the horizon, the lookouts on the Bismarck saw them. First one silhouette, then another. The shapes were unmistakable. They were the British heavy ships. Admiral Tovey's flagship, HMS King George V, and the veteran battleship HMS Rodney, a slow but brutally powerful ship armed with 9 massive 16-inch guns. They were closing the distance, their flags whipping in the wind, their crews at battle stations. The destroyers, their long night's vigil over, pulled away to give the battleships a clear field of fire. The circle had closed. There was nowhere left to run. The Bismarck, its guns still fully operational, but its ability to maneuver non-existent, turned as best it could to face the approaching enemy. Captain Ernst Lindemann intended to sell his ship and the lives of his men as dearly as possible. The final act was about to begin. For the nearly 2,200 men aboard the Bismarck, the long chase was over. All that remained was the fight and the sea. The final battle began at 8:47 a.m. on the morning of May 27th. The British battleship Rodney, with its 9 16-inch guns, opened fire, followed moments later by the King George V. The first salvos were a storm of steel, shells weighing more than a ton, each screaming across the gray water. The Bismarck, a crippled but still defiant beast, responded with its own main guns. Its first shots were unnervingly accurate, straddling the Rodney and proving that even in its death throes, the German warship's gunnery was superb. But it was a futile effort. A warship's accuracy depends on a stable platform and the ability to maneuver. The Bismarck had neither. It was a stationary target, wallowing in the heavy Atlantic swell, while the British ships could dictate the range and angle of the engagement at will. The fight was a brutal, one-sided execution. The British shells began to find their mark with relentless, methodical precision. One of the first hits destroyed the Bismarck's main fire control director, effectively blinding the ship's primary armament. Soon after, shells struck the forward super-firing turrets, Anton and Bruno, silencing them forever. The return fire from the Bismarck became sporadic, then ceased altogether as the aft turrets, Caesar and Dora, were also knocked out of action. In less than an hour, the world's most advanced battleship had been disarmed, its legendary guns twisted and broken. The British cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire then closed the range, adding their own 8-inch guns to the merciless bombardment. The superstructure of the Bismarck was systematically demolished, transformed into a burning, unrecognizable scrapyard of twisted steel. Fires raged across its decks, and the once proud vessel was reduced to a floating wreck, a silent, smoking hulk. Yet, incredibly, it refused to sink. The armored citadel, the brilliant fortress at the core of its design, was holding. Hundreds of shells, from heavy 16-inch armor-piercing rounds to smaller caliber projectiles, had struck the ship, but its vital spaces remained largely unbreached. The Bismarck was defeated, disarmed, and burning, but its heart was still beating. It remained stubbornly afloat, a testament to the sheer resilience of its construction. By 10 a.m., Admiral Tovey, his battleships running critically low on fuel and their ammunition lockers depleted, decided he could do no more. The Bismarck was a wreck that posed no further threat. He ordered his capital ships to break off the engagement and return to base. The task of finishing the job was left to the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire. Closing to point-blank range, the Dorsetshire fired 2 torpedoes into the Bismarck's starboard side. They struck home, causing the ship to list heavily. The cruiser then circled around to the port side and fired another. This final torpedo sealed the Bismarck's fate. At the same time, deep within the shattered hull of the German warship, the surviving senior officer Hans Oels had given the order to scuttle the ship. Demolition charges were set in the engine rooms to ensure the pride of the German Navy would never be captured as a prize. The combination of the British torpedoes and the German scuttling charges was the final blow. The great battleship began to list dramatically, its deck awash with water. Its colors still flying, the Bismarck capsized and, at 10:39 a.m., sank stern-first into the Atlantic. Its propellers the last thing to disappear beneath the waves. The hunt was over. The Bismarck was gone, but the human tragedy was just beginning. Over 2,000 German sailors were left struggling in the cold, oil-slicked waters of the Atlantic. The British cruisers Dorsetshire and Maury began rescue operations, pulling exhausted, oil-covered survivors from the sea. But their efforts were cut short. A U-boat alarm, a feared sighting of an approaching German submarine, forced the British ships to abandon the rescue and depart the area at speed to avoid becoming targets themselves. It was a brutal but necessary decision of war. Of the more than 2,200 men who had sailed on the Bismarck, only 115 would survive. The sea would claim the rest, a final, terrible price for a mission that had lasted only 9 days. The loss of the Bismarck was a devastating strategic and psychological blow to the Kriegsmarine and to the German High Command. Hitler, who had never been a strong proponent of surface naval power, became deeply risk-averse, losing all faith in the ability of his capital ships to challenge the Royal Navy. The planned Atlantic raids were cancelled. The Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, would spend most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that posed a constant threat but would never again risk a major sortie into the Atlantic. The era of the German surface raider, which had begun with such promise with the Graf Spee and culminated in the awesome power of the Bismarck, was effectively over. For the British, the victory was a massive boost to morale and a critical strategic success. The primary surface threat to their Atlantic lifeline had been eliminated. In the final analysis, the story of the Bismarck is a perfect, tragic case study of a fatal flaw. The ship was, by almost every measure, a masterpiece of naval engineering. Its armor was incredibly resilient, its guns were lethally accurate, and its speed gave it a decisive advantage. It was a vessel that successfully absorbed hundreds of shells and a number of torpedo hits, without its core citadel ever being decisively breached. It did not sink because it was outfought in a conventional sense. Its guns were silenced and its superstructure was wrecked, but the ship itself refused to founder. It sank only after it was completely paralyzed, a helpless wreck made so by a single, almost impossibly lucky torpedo hit. The fatal flaw was not a result of shoddy workmanship or a foolish design. It was the result of a doctrine, an entire philosophy of naval construction, that prized the ability to withstand punishment above all else. In creating a ship that could survive a direct slugging match with any battleship on Earth, the German designers had accepted a trade-off, leaving the ship's ability to maneuver vulnerable. They had built a perfect body but had failed to protect its Achilles heel. All the Bismarck's immense strength, all its power and speed, became utterly irrelevant the moment it could no longer control its own direction. It stands as a timeless and brutal lesson in warfare and engineering, that the most powerful designs can be undone by the smallest oversights, and that in any complex system strength is ultimately determined not by its most formidable feature but by its most critical weakness.